Good evening. Tonight we're going to talk about a little bit about insurance. We're going to talk about not only automobile insurance, also homeowners insurance, and then health insurance. Health insurance is a mess, as you probably know. It's very political, and so politicians, being what politicians are, they use it to their advantage. Yeah, everybody thinks there's an easy solution, but nope, not gonna happen. Um, but auto and home insurance, that's a little more straightforward. So we'll talk about that. And lastly, after this, in a separate lecture, there'll be a uh, midterm prep to get you ready for the exam, but that'll be a separate video. Um, so insurance, what happens is the insurance is based upon the concept that not everybody has a bad day on the same day. That's how insurance works. So there's a lot of conceptual things that people think are insurance that can't be insurance. Some types of health insurance that can happen to people simultaneously or can have like pre-existing conditions and stuff. There's a need perhaps for society to pay for some of those things and to cover some of those things or to spread it out, but to put that on a private insurance company, that doesn't fit the concept, the model of insurance. And what happens is it makes insurance unaffordable for the other folks, and so the whole system breaks down because then the other folks don't take the insurance, and that's how it happens. So, for example, the easy example is vehicle insurance. If you wreck your car, people who wreck their car, once a week or once a month or something, pretty soon they end up without insurance just because they're obviously not good drivers. But for the rest of us, the chance for a vehicle accident is, a couple every 3, maybe 10 years, something like that. So the fact that we all have to pay a premium, and when we do have a bad day, and even a place like Alaska, let's say, 700,000 folks, if there's 20, 30 accidents, but there's 700,000 people who didn't have accidents, well, then that's absorbed quite easily. The insurance company can, fix those people's cars, perhaps take care of maybe some injuries that might have occurred. But the insurance company as a business can still, make a profit and survive. And again, it's not about greed of the insurance companies, it's about survival. The worst case scenario, using another example, would be flood insurance. Let's say, there's an insurer and they're, down in Florida or something like that. There's a horrific hurricane, everybody gets flooded. Well, now you've got millions of folks and they're all out at the same time. They all have that catastrophe at the same time. What happens there? Don't be under any illusion that the insurance company is going to cover that. The insurance company has a finite amount of money, and yeah, the insurance company is going to probably pay out what they have, go bankrupt, and then for those other, maybe they take care of 100,000 people. That other, you know, 7,900,000 people, they're left with nothing. So that's why, for example, flood insurance, they won't allow a private company to offer flood insurance because it's a false promise. They can't promise to cover people in a flood. What would happen is a private company would take everybody's money, and then when they're actually called upon, they'd skip town. They'd, you know, maybe go bankrupt, maybe set up a flood insurance gig in some other place and take everybody's money until they're relied upon for payments, and then they're just gonna go bankrupt again. And anyway, so it's not a win situation. So uh, auto insurance is in private business because it can be profitable or can at least survive. But flood insurance, that's a federal program. Only the federal government can offer flood insurance. They may have brokers on the private end for simplicity for execution of it, but no, by default, they can't offer insurance. So anyway, that's how insurance, the big concept works. Ensures the damages to your auto home are covered. So again, not everybody's house is going to burn down. Not everybody's car is going to get wrecked. Also, the personal assets liability, if you've got a ladder or a rake in the yard buried under the snow or a swimming pool and somebody drowns in it, yeah, that person who's injured due to your maybe negligence or just whatever, but somehow you're found responsible. Responsible is the concept of liability. You're liable for somebody else's damages, then you cover it. So, anyway, and for you as in a personal finance realm, you're busy out trying to get everything done. In terms of your life, you're trying to make money, you're trying to pay for your house, take care of your family, and these one-off black swan kind of events, like somebody drowning in a swimming pool that you happen to own, um, yeah, you don't necessarily want that wiping all of your finances out and taking your house and everything else because of a very unfortunate but very, very infrequent event. So, anyway, now if you contribute to that, if you make the liability or whatever, if you happen to cause that thing by carelessness, in insurance terms, they'd call that negligence, then yeah, it's going to go much worse for you and perhaps exceed the amount you're insured for just because, they've got a good lawyer on their side and you may have been a bit stupid or careless and they can take full advantage of it. Okay, so risk. Risk is something we all live with. Everybody has risk. Exposure, events, or perils. Perils are things like fire, wind, hail. If you're ever in an insurance policy, you do not want an insurance like, for example, there's another scam where they sell you like cancer insurance. And everybody's like, oh, wow, I need to get that. Well, no, you need to get all perils. If you're sick or hurt or whatever, do you care whether it's cancer or do you care whether it's, something just degrading your house? When you get specificity in terms of perils, that's not a good thing for you. What you want is all perils. You don't care what happened, but your house is destroyed, your health is bad, whatever. Whatever the cause was, whatever the peril was, is not nearly as important as you being made whole at the end of it. Risk management, yep, decisions about how you're going to protect yourself. Avoid risk. Well, avoid risk is difficult. In this case, they say don't own any assets. In a life case, it'd be don't drive. Well, you're not really completely avoiding risk unless you're going to stay in the house. You're going to get somebody else to drive for you. You're going to get chauffeured. You're going to get an Uber where you're paying, you know, somebody else a fee, but they're actually having to cover their insurance. You're not going to get away from exposure to risk without. Anyway, what you want to do is reduce risk. Avoidance of risk is exceedingly difficult. Reducing risk is something you can do. You can mitigate risk. You can maybe get a car with airbags, get a car, wear your seatbelt, do things like that. That will reduce risk. And then also in a asset situation, smaller assets or assets that aren't quite as put at risk. Accept risk if it's something that's you're going, this is such a low probability of happening. Maybe you can just say, fine, I'm just going to deal with it. For example, the state of Alaska is what they call self-insured, where they just say, if we make payments to an insurance company, a third party, and all our vehicles, and you calculate, it's such a large enterprise, the state, and we've got fairly deep pockets. Why not just be self-insured? We're large enough to where we can pull that off. You as an individual, if you've got exceedingly deep pockets, you can typically not have to have the mandatory auto insurance if you're willing to post a bond and show that you have the financial, wherewithal to sustain some sort of, car accident or something else and be able to take care of whatever injuries, damage you caused. You can sometimes do that. But for most of us, what we do is we insure against the risk. We realize that we can't avoid the risk. We reduce the risk to the minimum possible. But for that remaining risk that still exists, even though it's a very, very remote chance of happening, we would prefer to pay somebody a premium, an insurance company, a certain amount of money, and they pool that with their other customers, and they cover us against that risk. So it's a way of basically getting through life without putting all of your assets at risk. Types of insurance, yeah, you can insure against all sorts of things. If you're doing events, shipping insurance for large shipments going on the seas and stuff. But for in the personal finance realm, it's usually property, life insurance, health insurance. Property insurance, for most of us, we're carrying a mortgage on the home. So even though we talk about our home, it's really the mortgage companies because they're the ones with the note. They're the ones carrying the financing on it. So they're going to insist that you have property insurance. Insurance company operations. So anyway, they're commercial enterprises. That's how they make money. Is they try to assess this risk. They have these people who can do quite a bit of math and actuaries that look at situations, determine basically what the odds are of something bad happen, and setting their premiums so that the amount they're taking in terms of premiums is a little bit more than what they're paying out, and it needs to be competitive. Now they are regulated, the state or yeah, typically states run the insurance type things in terms of qualifications, making sure that the insurance company has the proper resources, the proper money set aside. Any extra money, though, insurance companies tend to invest. But the reason why you don't typically, as a personal finance person, invest with insurance companies is because they have to be quite risk averse. They have to stay with very, very conservative investments due to the nature of their business. They need to keep this money in reserve and they can't speculate or do anything crazy with the money. Here's some different examples. Yep. So auto insurance for damage to car, medical liability. Stuff gets quite expensive. Personal injury lawyers and all that. Home repairs from a homeowner's insurance. Health insurance. Health insurance just gets fuzzy very quick. And then long-term care insurance. Let's say you get to be quite old or it could happen at any time, but you need some long-term care, some sort of dementia or some slow disease. The scary thing about nursing homes all that is, if you remember back in COVID, they talked about how horrible it was that all these people in the nursing homes were dying. Well, worse than that is the actual statistics on nursing homes. If you check into a nursing home, odds are within 6 months, 50% of those people roughly are deceased. So they may talk about long-term care, but the insurance companies know long-term is probably 6 months. Not a pleasant place to be. Become disabled, typically on a workplace is a different matter, but also just disabled from life circumstances. And then life insurance. Unfortunately, collect this one. You have to pass away. Role of insurance agents and brokers may be a bit diminished. Most of the time, insurance products are are semi-complex, and so there's going to be somebody to insert themselves in there who's certified, licensed to conduct and issue policies. But more and more things become automated, and somebody who has some sort of certificate will maybe approve or bless it. But if you're actually using an agent because of commissions and everything else, it gets a bit more expensive for most of us, we'd go online or do minimum, involvement with a human until the very end, and then just sort of seal the deal. Otherwise, the prices get too expensive. I've had sort of full service insurance agents, and I prefer to have that anonymity. I was insured with State Farm here locally for a while, and oh my God, they were like creeping around and looking at the home, going, "Well, it looks like what." My home is an old homestead, and it's it's probably going to be condemned at a certain point because it's too close to the road and they're building a bike path. So, there's a thing called eminent domain where the government, if there's a road coming through and whatever, they'd be forced to buy it, from me at fair market value. So the notion of me wanting to dump a bunch of money into it, I'd rather build a house um, further to the interior of the property. This lot itself is like 100 acres, and why the primary house is 17 foot from a highway is kind of stupid, or 37, I guess, 17 from the bike path. Anyway, auto insurance. So if you want to not have insurance on your vehicle in terms of protecting your vehicle, and if it's not financed, you can do that. But the legal requirements coming from the liability standpoint, the other drivers out there, that's not legal for you to be out there driving on the roads and not be able to cover the damages that you might be able to incur. So if you want to not have coverage for your own vehicle, you can do that, and that extra coverage for your vehicle is called collision. But if you just have straight liability, in the event of an accident, yeah, you're stuck with your broken car. There's no money that's going to be paid to you for fixing that vehicle, but the other person's vehicle will receive some amount of money. Now, again, if you've got a loan on that vehicle, your lender will probably not allow you not to have, full coverage. But that's it. Costs, yeah, personal injury attorneys. I've met quite a few lawyers over the years, and I met two guys who were probably the best lawyers. They're actually Anchorage guys, but they make a killing in personal injury. But man, they talk about job satisfaction. They hated their jobs. They wanted to work with me on, a couple of projects I had going on that involved horses and potentially a bar type thing and some other stuff. But they were just so bored with the personal injury. I mean, but they were good at it. And, they described to me the situation about a lady, she hit a moose and she had a friend in the passenger seat, and the moose went through that side, went right through the windshield, and it either killed or severely injured the passenger. And, this lady just the driver just lost everything because she was the only one to be sued. It wasn't necessarily her fault. I mean, it was the moose, but you can't sue a moose. Certainly wasn't the passenger. So the only one left was the lady who was driving the vehicle. And, we've all been there. There's not a whole lot you can do when a moose runs in front of you. But anyway, she was the closest thing, the only thing available to be sued. And anyway, so it wasn't one of their prouder moments, but that's why they were telling me be very careful what you do, because liability and who's at fault and all that sometimes is superseded by, well, who's got the money to pay, who's got the deep pockets. So it's a scary. Anyway, no fault insurance. They've tried to do that to get some of the lawyers out, but it doesn't always work. These personal injury attorneys, if there's some situation or there's some negligence, again, somebody did something stupid. If you get in a DUI and you've got no fault insurance, yeah, they're still going to find you at fault. Don't worry, and it will not go well for you. So liability coverage, that's what I talked about before. That's just protecting the other guy, right? The other person, nothing about your vehicle. Policy limits. When they quote policy limits, they always do them in a series of these three numbers. So this is the injured. Um, this is for all the people. So these are medical, and then the last one's for the property damage. Yeah, you look at some of the new trucks and stuff, especially. I mean, they're pushing 100 grand. So if it exceeds that, then they're coming after you. So when you get the minimum insurance, you definitely want to look at the policy because the state limits are laughably low in a lot of times. Um, anyway, the law is that you purchase the minimum amount, and the minimums are usually not quite as high as they should be. Um, B is this medical coverage, so other passengers when you're at fault, so applies only to the insured car. Here are some of these state limits. I mean, see, the medical stuff can quickly exceed these front numbers quite quickly. But 15,000, 5,000 in California, I don't know why those numbers even exist. Anyway, here's Alaska, 50. So that'd be quoted as 50, 125. So anyway, you need to probably exceed these numbers. So that's one thing you're looking at when you're getting your insurance. And the thing is, as you have more money, as you gain more assets, you appear to be more of a target for some of the lawyers. They are definitely going to check what they're up against. If you have a lawyer who's not being paid by the hour but is relying on the outcome, if they're taking a percentage of the final award, they're definitely looking at who they're suing. So the different states, but they're all pretty low. Utah, well, with the PIP damage, but 15,000, so that's not too far from Alaska. Okay, and then the coverage C is the uninsured, underinsured. So they know that there's going to be some people who are not going to get insurance. And you don't want to be out. You want your vehicle fixed. So if you had the liability only, you might have a problem. So there's different comments. Probably a lot of underinsured motorists out there though. Collision. Now this has to do with your own vehicle. Now this is where the policies get more expensive though. And that's why a lot of people will drop collision, especially for an older vehicle. That kind of makes sense. Comprehensive is what fixes, windshields, hail, other stuff that's not covered. So, if your car like burns in your garage, is that a homeowner's insurance claim or is that an auto insurance claim? Anyway, things get kind of interesting. Some of the electric vehicles, especially too, they don't do super well in salt water in the flooding zones and have caused a number of fires and burnt down the homes. So anyway, if you're in one of those environments, which we are not, you have to be very careful because you could endanger your homeowner's insurance by having a dangerous, what they consider a dangerous vehicle parked in the garage. Deductible. Another way to adjust the amount you're paying for your premiums, if you can handle it, is to go with a higher deductible. So I've done this quite a bit where I'll have like $1,000 deductible, which seems like, golly, that's a lot, but not really. The problem is, let's say you have a $250 deductible. Well, you're thinking, wow, I only have to come up with $250 before the insurance company starts, engaging. But the insurance company, by virtue of you having this lower deductible, they know that you're going to have a higher, propensity to file claims. The other problem is when you file claims, they may pay for your thing, but they also raise your rates. So I've had this discussion before, and this is, again, had to do with this local homeowners insurance. I had a heating pipe break and ruin some flooring, and talk to her. And in fact, I just had another thing. And anyway, you always get in these discussions with the agents. They're like, well, if you want to report it, your premiums are gonna go up. It's gonna be 7,500 on homeowners insurance. I have a $7,500 deductible. Like, is it gonna be over 7,500 bucks? If it's gonna be close, you're better off just paying it and not reporting it. And it just kind of, anyway, I kind of go with the minimum possible on homeowners insurance. One interesting, well, we'll get to it here in a second, but one interesting thing up here is earthquake insurance, which most people don't have because it's prohibitively expensive. So anyway, we talked about comprehensive, we talked about collision. Sorry for the slides rolling around. We talked about deductible. There's other things that can be covered in auto insurance. Yep. I had a policy in Europe, a skiing policy that was like amazing. And it covered the helicopter to fly me off the slope, would kennel my dog, would get my car back home because it was assumed I'd have to take the train home. And I mean, you can get just crazy provisions in insurance. And in auto insurance, yeah, there's all sorts of extras, rental car reimbursement and other stuff that may not seem like a big deal, but may be, quite fortuitous if you get in a wreck. If you just have a single car. If you got multiple cars, then you really need to pay for rental car reinsurance. You would take your other vehicle, perhaps your old truck or whatever you got sitting by the side. Also, road hazard and other things that might be nice to have, or, a tow truck's going to be, I don't know. I usually get the ones that put me and the dog inside. Unfortunately, I know more tow truck drivers than I should. But yeah, it's about $350 or so, and it's about a once every 2 year kind of occurrence. And I just pay for it. But I could get it, routed through my insurance. So here's again a summary of some of these provisions. Bodily injury, damage to your own car for collision, medical. The medical is where the real expense is going to come up. And comprehensive are kind of the cats and dogs, everything else. What affects the insurance premiums? The value of the car, a lot of it. The repairability of the car. Certain cars have problems. Again, I know you guys are tired of me talking about electric vehicles, but if you damage that battery, on the bottom of the vehicle, it's not like they can just replace small parts. It might be the whole battery, which is kind of pricey. So they factor that in on the insurance. And then your personal characteristics, your age, your mileage, your driving record. They can get down on the weeds if they want. They smoker versus non-smoker, whatever correlation they think they can find. That again, these people, they do a lot of math. They have, big data available, and they'll see, these guys seem to crash more than others, and so we're going to raise the rates. So, some correlation between how you do in school versus how you drive. What you do have a chance to do is go with different companies, and now you can go on, different sites and see what's competitive and not get too lumped in. One thing they do try to get you to do is have all of your policies with the same company. If it makes financial sense, I might do that, but currently I don't. In fact, I have one company that insures classic vehicles, which is sad, shows the vintage of some of the vehicles I drive, but supposedly my old 4Runner is considered a classic, and I get full coverage on it for very, very low. And so then I have another insurance company that will, register large trucks without calling them commercial vehicles. And so sometimes you end up with more insurance companies than you want. But anyway, whatever works on your specific situation, but compare prices. Yeah, these numbers I found were kind of crazy. because these were a bit dated. And I think, oh shoot, I thought I put them in here. Anyway, these numbers have gone way, way up. Maybe we'll come across the slide that I added. Somehow it looks like I put it erroneously someplace else. But if you go someplace like, well, Tornado Alley, Oklahoma particularly, outrageous amounts of homeowner costs. So that's probably why I'm confused. On auto insurance, we're looking more at lawyers and cost of attorneys and stuff. So Alaska would probably be mid-range, but depends on, how favorable the courts are to allowing large damages, which obviously New York must be fairly, you know, fairly friendly court system to victims and the lawyers. Homeowners insurance. So now we're moving into, the home itself. Um, Fire to burglary, typically not flooding. Different perils. You want all perils. Now, again, you're not going to typically find a policy that's going to cover earthquake insurance. So if that's something that's super important to you, you will pay for it, but you'll do it in some sort of separate package. And again, depends where you live. Even local areas within Alaska, um, we're all pretty high in the earthquake realm, but some areas are worse. This old house was built, in the 50s by homesteaders, and it's been through. Well, it's obviously been through the one back in the 60s. So I think if it was going to fall down, it probably already would have. Here's some of the perils they're talking about. They've got them categorized down. Not so important to you. You just need to make sure you've got your own, for whatever situation you're in, whether it be a mobile home or condominium or whatever, that you've got the appropriate coverage. This is important, and it will make a difference. If you see get a very low quote on homeowners insurance, it may be what they call a cash value policy, which means that you've got this TV that you think, yeah, I just bought it 2-3 years ago. It still works perfect, and I paid whatever. You probably paid more for it than you should have if you're, early adopter and you bought it when the technology was brand new and now it's not worth much. Well, they're going to give you not worth much price at this point. They're going to say, yeah, that technology's dated, it's older, we don't see it being worth that. And you, with your house being burned down, and they give you, $150 to replace your $2,000 TV, you're not happy. Now, if you had that big TV and you had the replacement cost, they're going to give you a like type of TV. So one thing is you got to be able to establish what you have. So going around, and we'll talk more about this later, but taking perhaps a video of the inventory of all the things you have is kind of handy to establish what you had and the condition of it and all that kind of stuff. Since after a fire, things are going to be melted, missing. But some of these cash versus replacement costs, this can be eye-watering when you get to clothes. If you think all of your, attire, all of your fashion type stuff, to replace that stuff at new retail prices would be exorbitant. If they're just going to give you replacement cost, it's like thrift store pricing. You're just not going to get there. So for most of us, we probably want a replacement cost policy to make sure that we've already got enough stuff going on. Something very bad has happened, and now we don't need this extra financial burden of trying to re-equip the house on a budget. Other structures, yeah. Again, I've got a structure on my property where I put a lot line right in between it because I did not want a certain structure included because it's sketchy. I didn't want. Anyway, the insurance company called me up and they were looking at the satellite photos. They said, "We noticed this shop building and it's not on your policy." I'm like, "Yeah, I don't want it on the policy." And so anyway, they were fine with that, but they were concerned that it had been put on the policy. So sheds and other items, if they're of value, in most cases, unless you've got something weird going on like I do, you want to make sure that's covered. Personal property. The thing about personal property, if you've got a lot of stuff in a certain category, like let's say you've got a bunch of jewelry, or you've got a bunch of photo equipment, or electronics, or guns, or something like that, and you think it's covered under your normal insurance policy, you're probably going to be sadly mistaken. That in-depth policy, that whole policy packet, if you would have read it in detail, you probably would have realized that, any one category is limited to a certain dollar amount. So for jewelry or something, all your jewelry is covered up to an amount of $1,000 or something, or guns up to, $1,000 or something like that. Where whatever. So the way around this is you need to be basically honest with the insurance provider and then have those items inventoried and delineated on the policy. And it may take a separate policy or some sort of addendum, a contract writer, a personal property floater. There's all sorts of different terms that kind of all mean the same thing. It's just like an additional contract, a subset of that contract to delineate those other items because you don't have coverage, the coverage you probably thought you had. And it's not going to be an issue until it gets destroyed, and then you're going to be really disappointed. Liability, this gets back to, you know, somebody comes on your home and they slip and fall, and, woe be to you if they find it was negligent. You had the swimming pool, which isn't that common in Alaska, I realize, but you didn't have the fence around it, or you had the rake or the ladder buried under the snow right where the, person was walking, and somehow you're at fault. So anyway, other provisions, yeah, where you're going to live while the house is being rebuilt, um, loss of the use of your things. Why, there's some policies that will cover all that. So homeowners insurance, though, is fairly straightforward. Business insurance is kind of a nightmare. Like farm insurance is exceedingly difficult. You can't even get it in the state for the most part. Anyway, just be happy that as long as you're doing mainstream stuff, you'll typically be able to get homeowners insurance. Value of the home, how much you want in the deductible, location. More an issue, you go to someplace fire prone, like California, where they've got all sorts of they've got all sorts of arsonists, and then they've got, people building right in the woods without taking care of the trees, and then the utility companies, they don't dare touch their power lines because they could get sued. They'd rather just the fire happen and then say it was an act of God. So anyway, all sorts of unique things going on, that can affect your policy. Um, but don't be surprised if maybe they'll ask you, or maybe they'll just look on a map, but they'll want to know like how far you are from the fire station. Are there any fire hydrants in your neighborhood? Certain things like that seem kind of obscure, but you can tell where they're going. Um, and then degree of protection. Obviously, if they say, you know, obviously you have fire alarms, you have this security system, you have something going on, be honest about it, but certainly do some shopping if necessary to figure out what's going to save you a bit of money. And then the discounts, that can sometimes happen if you have your policies, like your auto and your homeowner's policy with the same one. sometimes they'll give you a break, or they'll give you a break for not filing many claims, which again, when you file a claim, you kind of get put on that bad boy list, and they share that list. The insurance companies definitely cooperate. If you get canceled by one insurance company, don't think you're going to go to another insurance company and start fresh. No, they've got a master database to cover all of that stuff. Here's those numbers I was looking at to compare other states. So on homeowners insurance, it does make a huge difference. You can see these things out there where the tornadoes happen, just astronomical. Up here, average annual cost, national average 24. In Alaska, I don't get it for that cheap. I think one of mine is 17, the other one's like 1900 a year. So again, it depends on the value of the home and what else is going on. That having more property and kind of being in sticks probably raises it a bit. But yeah, certain prone states. Where's Florida? Florida should be on here. And California now is getting that way too, just because of the rebuilding costs. Strategies to increase your deductible, improve protection. Yeah, they use that one insurer to get a discount, stay with the same company, don't file claims, shop around. So not a whole lot you can do, but I've never filed a claim. I've thought about it, but the silly agent, well, not silly. I mean, I guess they're looking out for my own good, but it's like, why do I have insurance when every time I call you, you say, don't you dare file a claim because you'll regret it in the long run. Now, if I had a whole house burned down, that would be a no-brainer. But usually I get things that happen in the mid-range where they're like, yeah, just take care of yourself. Suck it up. Renter's insurance. So this just insures your items, but it also has some liability coverage, which the landlord likes. Landlords will often insist that you have renter's insurance so that if something bad happens, they go after the renter first before messing with the landlord. So obviously it doesn't cost the landlord anything to say, hey, you need to have renter's insurance. It's not his problem. And forcing you to do it. But it's not huge money. Again, if you have something in a special category, make sure you mention it, but they're not covering that much. They're not covering the structure or anything like that. They're just covering your personal effects. Umbrella policy. Umbrella is a good term. Just like, these defined specific peril policies are a problem. I've got a umbrella personal liability policy just because I don't know what might happen. I'm not, I would say a wealthy person, but whatever. I don't want it all to go on a lawsuit. I deal with a lot of horses, a lot of people on four-wheelers, and I mean, people manage to hurt themselves all the time. And if it happens to happen on your property, they're trying to it's not a good situation. All right, so that stuff is pretty straightforward. Health and disability insurance, like I say, is very fuzzy. The problem with health insurance, number one, it's more political than any other insurance. Back when they had the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, as they call it, they made it sound like we've got this. Well, we do have a problem, but they wanted to make it sound like everybody was going to be uninsured unless this Affordable Care Act was passed. The Affordable Care Act only helps less than 3% of the people. If you don't have much money, then you're going to be on Medicaid. That's more of a welfare kind of program. And then Medicaid's for the older people. So you've got, there's Medicaid, and this is Medicaid for children. And then Medicare, that is for definitely the impoverished. So Medicaid over 65, Medicaid CHIP, that's for the children that for some reason fall under Medicaid, and then Medicare is more like the welfare thing that we think about. But the big deal is the employer sponsored, almost 50%. So getting back to the concept of insurance, insurance works because you have multiple people, and so you have this big pool. Well, employers and insurance company providers are very comfortable insuring groups like that, and they can do it efficiently. And so employers can offer a very good incentive to their employees by having some sort of medical coverage as part of it. So it's kind of a win-win. Then you have this uninsured, which again sounds like, oh, 10% of the people don't have insurance. Well, there is some transition, people going from one type to another. So that's maybe a percent or so. But another portion are the ultra wealthy, and I'm not sure you want to say top 1%, top 2%, 3%. These insurances get kind of expensive, and a lot of people will, or a substantial number, will go self-insured. If you walk into a doctor and you say, I'm not going to be billing this through insurance, I'm going to be paying cash or, some sort of cash equivalent. Oh my God, the rates will just fraction because they don't have to go through the administrative route, and they don't have to, when they bill, the federal government through one of these programs, looking for, they bill for $1,000 worth of charges, they're going to get a fraction of that. They don't give, the government's got a certain percentage they give. So it's just much cheaper for them, for a provider, for a doctor to provide services to somebody who's on a cash basis. So anyway, it's still, that's a high number, but there's some, explanation. You have people that are unbanked, you have people that are undocumented, you have people that make up this 9%, and it's not all of them are in a perfect world, they'd all have insurance, but you're always going to have some percentage without insurance. So it can be offered by private insurance companies. So that would be, through employers, and that's going to be roughly about half. And then you're going to have a lot offered by the federal government. Now, what they were pushing for, and particular political sides on the left would want what they call single payer, and that just means the government is the single payer. And then on the right, they typically want more of a private approach where the government has a lesser role and it's private companies. But the problem with this issue is it's super contentious, and it's just, we may think it's a horrible system, but if you're a politician, this is the best thing ever. You can pit people against one another, and you can go to the election and if you fix the problem, you wouldn't have the problem anymore, and then you wouldn't have anything to campaign on. For example, and this is kind of getting maybe a little astray, but if you look at the abortion argument in the UK, abortion is legal, and it's not really disputed because they voted on it. There's a lot of people who feel abortion is, horrendous, completely wrong, but they didn't win the election, and they stood by the results. And the people who wanted abortion, well, obviously they're happy. But anyway, it's not an issue that's up for debate or argument anymore. Whereas in the States, the issue comes up over and over again. And because politicians don't want to vote on it, they don't want their name associated with winning or losing, they're not going to do anything definitive. And the same thing applies to health insurance. If they solved health insurance, if they went with one of these programs and they put it to a large scale referendum where everybody voted and that was settled law, then they wouldn't have something to campaign on and solicit donations and special interest, and the donor class, the big money who actually drives the elections, they wouldn't be as involved. So anyway, it's don't expect it to go away anytime soon. You can see how inefficient the U.S. system is. expenditures per capita. We spend a horrendous amount of money. Where in Europe, Europe is not like there's nothing cheap in Europe except their healthcare is relatively cheaper than ours. Now, there is another element here where Europeans will spend twice as much on food, maybe better quality food, and half as much on healthcare. So there's something to be said for that, that there's more in prevention sometimes. But anyway, interesting snippets. Cost of insurance, yeah. So here they're going to go on the, talking about the Affordable Care Act and how it needs to be rectified. So cost of health insurance, about 1 in 5 uninsured. Yeah, they were showing about 9%. Whatever 9% would be about 1 in 10 uninsured. But anyway, um, many options available. But it's definitely an issue where it will drive the vote. It will drive people's habits. It will get people incredibly, it's very emotional, get people very concerned and very agitated. So the politicians are not going to let that one go. The actual contents of the policy, yeah, the person who's there, where they are, pre-existing conditions. So again, if I haven't alienated some of you, this will probably take out the rest. If you insure pre-existing conditions, let's put this back on an auto insurance or a homeowner's insurance. Let's say you go to the insurance company, you say, I want to insure my Camaro, and they go, okay, great. We need to see the vehicle. Say, oh no, the vehicle's been crashed. I need to get insurance though because I need to get it paid for. It's like, wait a minute, you can't insure something that's already, wrecked. Or you try to do the same thing with your house. It's like, oh no, the house is burned down, but I didn't have insurance. I need to get insurance now. So it's a very emotional and whatever situation. But if you've got a pre-existing condition, it doesn't fit the insurance model because insurance it doesn't work that way. Insurance works on the chance that something bad might happen, whereas you're entering this argument with something bad has already happened. So now, if somebody has a situation like that, a condition like that, there needs to be a different role to pay for that because you can't fund that through some sort of private company because if you try to, it makes the premiums unaffordable for the other folks because it's no longer an insurance model. It's something else entirely when you have parts of the pool that are not in like new condition coming into the situation. And I realize we're talking about people here, but I also realize that this is an insurance when we're talking about pre-existing conditions. So anyway, another thing would be the cancellation renewability options on the policy. Most of the time, insurance companies, and this again gets very sensitive with personal information stuff. They want to know as much information as they can. They want to know family histories. They want to know, genetic markers or predisposition to certain things. So to either eliminate you from the pool or price your coverage appropriately. A lot of times they might just price your coverage just so shockingly high to prevent you from enrolling so they can just discourage you. Anyway, there's other things, rehabilitation, mental health that are important, but perhaps unaffordable through the private sector. So again, something needs to be done to take care of people in those situations, but to call it an insurance is a misnomer and it alleviates the responsibility. You can't expect that a company or a program is going to be self-funded when when that's part of the policy. Um, Other things, pregnancy, yeah, that's, you know, can be, yeah, anyway, it's something that needs coverage, and how that's going to be done. Now, dental insurance is kind of a hybrid here because that sort of does work in the private sector model pretty well. And the best item is vision insurance, where especially like things like LASIK surgery, because it's not typically insured and the marketplace is super competitive, very high tech, very automated, and the value for service that you get. I mean, they do some amazing, surgeries for very affordable prices, which for people who think, wow, if the rest of the medical system ran on that same sort of model with more, you know, cost pressure and more competition, we might end up with better outcomes. But anyway, determinants of unreimbursed medical expenses. So these are the ones that you might be able to write off in your taxes, the deductible part, the co-insurance. Sometimes you'll have a certain amount that you have to pay or pay for by a different company. Stop loss, when they can, um, start or stop your policy, coverage limits, and then coordination of benefits. Anyway, it gets very complex. Um, HR people with whatever company, if you're working for a firm, they tend to spend quite a bit of time on the medical expenses and the ins and outs, and it's obviously not a great system. You literally have people, insurance company execs getting murdered over this stuff, and it's a strange situation. But it would be naive to think that it's going to be resolved anytime soon, because you saw the money that's being made, you saw the political forces that can be generated by the conflict. It's you know it's a feature to some people rather than the bug. Anyway, expenses not covered by private insurance. You have a thing called a flexible spending account that you can opt for, um, but it's kind of weird. The funds can't be covered over to year. You can get a certain amount of your money designated to put in this flexible spending account, and it goes in there in a tax-free type thing. But I don't think they're really going to catch on. The numbers are quite low, and this use it or lose it provision makes it a little awkward. Medicare, if I didn't confuse you all before, we'll go back through it right now to reiterate. Medicare over 65. That's pretty much all you need to know. Most of you are so far from Medicaid that, or Medicare, that it's going to change by that point. But Medicare for the older folks. Medigap. These are just small insurance policies that cover some of the gaps in some of these Medicare policies. Some of these people are on fixed incomes, they're retirees, and they don't want to have to pay anything, so they're willing to pay, $30 a month for some small insurance that's going to take care of the gaps in the policy. Prescription Act, or that's changing a bit. This was the old one from 2003. They've made some updates. Medicaid, now this is can be for the aged, but the blind, disabled, and needy family with dependent children. So that's most of it, state by state. This is something this kind of demonstrates the, popularity of the um, Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare, whatever you want to talk about it. If you look at these numbers, so here you have Democrats, here you have Republicans. So you can see how what the political divide is. 91% of the Democrats have a favorable viewing of it, whereas 77% of Republicans have an unfavorable view. So it's very much a political divided issue. Long-term care insurance. Now, this has to do with like nursing home type care. The thing about this is you need to, if you think you're going to be in this situation, you've already kind of identified yourself as somebody who's probably had experience with this with somebody in your family. So the insurance companies are like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Does this person know something we don't? Do they expect themselves to be in this situation? If you wait till you actually need it, now, you're sort of back in the pre-existing condition where it's going to be unaffordable. So if it's something you're considering, um, you need to kind of opt for that early. Um, you have to look at the stats, look at the numbers, and decide what your risk tolerance is, what your assets are. It is typically quite expensive because the long-term care is quite expensive. So, and the fact that not everybody has it. Usually, the people who would take long-term care insurance are people who have some reason to think that they're going to be in that situation. So, it's a tough insurance market. Provisions about it. Yeah, I had a situation where I was going to have an operation done potentially and be down for a couple 3 months and miss some work. And I checked into the long-term care insurance I had that was by virtue of the company I was working for. It was absolute garbage. They weren't going to cover anything. I canceled the policy, um, and I never collected any money out of those people. It just wasn't going to work. It was more of a disability care than a long-term care, but 3 months was 3 months, and they weren't going to pay much at all. It was barely going to cover what I was paying in premiums. Yep, shop around. If you're in better health, that helps. You try and get it when you're younger, that helps. Now, obviously, you're going to be paying for it longer, but if you wait too long, you may find it's unavailable. Now, if you've done well and you've got a pretty good nest egg, is this something you need? Would you be better off investing that money for 20 years and ending up with this big chunk of money that, hey, if you need the long-term health care, then you jump into that big chunk of money. If not, use it for something else. So it'd be maybe your own, policy yourself to give yourself more flexibility. Disability insurance. This has to do with, your ability to, most cases, work. Most disability is associated with like workman's compensation or something like that, where you're going to get a policy. Let's say you're you're like a roofer and you happen to fall off a roof. You'd probably be pretty wise to have some sort of insurance or have your employer pay for some sort of insurance to protect you. But what they're talking about here, the own occupation or any occupation, let's say you fall off a roof and you're pretty jacked up, as likely would be falling off a roof. But, if you're on crutches or in a wheelchair from here on out, um, can you collect? Well, if it's in the own occupation, no, you're not going to be jumping up on roofs. That's your occupation. You're not going to be doing that anymore. So, um, I should start collecting right then. Well, that policy is going to be more expensive than the one that just says any occupation. You know, they're going to say, well, you're on crutches, you're in whatever. You need some training, but yeah, basically you need to learn the code. You're going to do something else in life, and you know, we're not paying because you could do another occupation. You just can't be climbing ladders anymore. Disability insurance, yep, the individual, the employer, and then Social Security. So a fair amount of abuse taken on in here. That's one of the things we talk about Social Security being insolvent part of it. Workman's comp, you do pay a little bit into this, and your employer pays a little bit, so that fund is actually funded, externally in addition to the government. But the Social Security thing is kind of a problem. What happens is if somebody can't work, and they file for some sort of disability, they'll end up, on a state program. Well, there are certain lawyers. There used to be a couple guys that wore these stupid cowboy hats or on bad TV shows. But anyway, their deal was to get the people on state benefits, get them on the federal Social Security, and so the states would pay these lawyers like $1,500 per person that they could get off of state benefits and put them on the federal system. So that's how you ended up with a lot of people on Social Security. The provisions, yep. Depends. There's so many different types of policies that are out there. But it is something that, can help people out if they're unable to work due to, some sort of injury. Waiting period. You'll find this with a lot of policies, a lot of insurance policies, where you have to, it has to go for a certain length of time. And again, what they're trying to eliminate here are pre-existing conditions. Say, oh, I can't get up on the roof anymore. I just happened to fall off the roof yesterday after I signed the policy paperwork. It's like, yeah, it's probably more likely you fell off the roof last week and you're just reporting it now after you got your insurance. So they may have some policy to say that you have to wait a bit. And that's kind of it. So this lecture, this is not my favorite. The health insurance in particular just kind of brings me down because there's no good solutions being proposed. It's a problem that's seems like there should be some solutions out there, but it's been going on forever, and I don't think anything's going to change. There is so much money, so much inefficiency in the system, and it's so powerful, especially with certain people. Certain people will do anything, for their health insurance. And UK, for example, I mean, their NHS, their National Health Service, it comprises a huge amount of their budget and drives all the elections, and we're almost to that point. In fact, we spend more per capita than they do. So very powerful situation, but very grim as well. Okay, so this midterm exam, I'm going to have a separate video on that. Make sure you watch it before you take the test. It should be on Blackboard, 40 questions, multiple choice. The time limit out there, the video just closes. It's not open book. Don't try and do that, because what will happen is if you're shifting around or exceed the time limit, it's not going to work well. You don't have enough time to, look up 40 questions. Besides, if you watch the video and you've paid attention, you're not going to be in a huge problem. Math is super simple, so you'll be fine there. All right, and that's it for tonight.